Welcome back. This is lecture 5, that is the final lecture of module 3. In this lecture, we will look at speech norms, language and class based variation, and within that we will talk about Bernstein's elaborated code versus restricted code. So, speech norms, what are speech norms? Basically, this refers to the typical features of a continuous speech. So, when we speak normally, when continuous speech, spontaneous speech happens, there are certain parameters that is always part of that. So, based on that, sometimes there are differences across communities, across classes and so on. So, primarily the baseline is that spontaneous speech is generally not self conscious, but on scrutinizing it we can find out some parameters. So, one of them is pauses. So, one of them is pause. So, it occurs roughly at the sentence or clause boundary, though it need not correspond to the punctuation of the writing. We often take pauses while we speak spontaneous speech. It may or may not overlap the punctuations, the comma full stop kind. This is sometimes generated out of a need to plan speech and produce it simultaneously. In case of continuous speech, might signal possible completion point and invitation to the other speaker to contribute, that is for turn taking, that we signal with a pause, we signal other person to speak. Sometimes we use fillers. Fillers are interesting, they occur in place of a conjunction with a pause accompanied by a level tone, typically to fill up gaps in the flow of speech. Sometimes we use a lot of those fillers, just some empty sounds to take some time till you think, something of that sort, and also indicated that the speech is to be continued. So, we are not completely stopping, we are taking a pause with a level tone, some sound that we are making, and then we are indicating that we have not completed. Repetition, again speech tends to be repetitious, reflecting the constraint of making it up as we go along. False starts and self corrections always happen. Sometimes we make some mistakes and then we self correct. These are simple patterns of speech. Now, when we have a conversation going, there are other things as well. So, back channel behavior is one. Now, back channel behavior is, it is a strategy used by the non-speaking participants in a conversation to indicate their alignment. So, you will either nod your head, or depending on the culture, sometimes some verbal input is also fine, or just to encourage the speaker. The reverse may also happen. If you do not agree with the speaker, you do not want him to go on speaking, that also can be signaled verbally, non-verbally, most of the time non-verbally. These are called back channel behavior. They are not really a turn taking in speech, but rather a form of support or lack of support. Then there is something called marker of sympathetic circularity. Sympathetic circularity happens when we want to take the audience along. We show that we do have some shared understanding, shared knowledge, and thereby we use certain markers that fine, see we are on the same boat, that kind of thing. So, there we use words like, ain't it, sort of, all this, where you understand that if I say this, the other person will automatically understand what I am talking about. So, these are markers of sympathetic circularity. These are some of the norms. Now, speech norms and have been studied with respect to social class, because language is inherently social, designed for social communication rather than for private use. Now, since social class organizes society, it naturally influences how language is used, evolved and valued. In the Chomskyan tradition, we have this idea of homogeneous idealized speaker listener who knows everything about the language. Now, this does not really reflect in the real life language use. And we have already seen that. We have already seen the various kinds of social variations in language use, depending on a number of factors. Within this module, we have talked about so many of different types. And today, we will also talk about class. So, social class within as a kind of a social variable. It is considered to be a cyclic relationship, in that particular kind of social structure leads to particular kind of linguistic behavior, and similarly that behavior reinforces or reproduces the social structure as well. Now, when we talk about social class and its connection with language, the first thing that you have to define is class. What is class? Now, this is not so easy. This has been problematized a bit over time, and that is why we realize that we need to define that as well. We need to talk about that as well. So, initially idea was that simple in intuitions like professionals from laborers, that kind of distinction was considered fine, but then eventually we realized that it is not enough for empirical research, because for empirical research you need to define, if you say that x belongs to class 1 and y belongs to class 2, you have to define how they differ on what parameters. So, as a result of which objective criteria will be needed, such as income, wealth, occupation, education, because education is always directly connected to occupation and wealth and so on, and place of residence also matters. Now, there are different theoretical approaches that define class, and as a result of which no single definition is universally accepted, but we will look at the dominant types of class distinction as to how class is understood. So, the older one, the Lebovian way of looking at it is a status based approach, which is a non-Marxist approach. It emphasizes the unity and prestige rather than conflict. Marxist approach is based on conflict rather than unity. So, class in this Lebovian understanding is seen as a continuous scale ranking people by education, income and occupation. So, this method encourages objective quantifiable measures for socio-linguistic research, and he developed socio-economic class indexes, linear scales and so on for using. So, he developed a lot of quantitative methods for understanding and studying class with respect to language. So, he classes grouped as lower, working, lower middle, and upper class by Lebov, and that this is what he used in his study. He used to correlate language variation within social rank. Then there is the idea of linguistic marketplace. So, language can also depend on the occupation specific linguistic demands, not just class rank. So, this is what was proposed by another group of researchers. So, jobs requiring public interaction like teachers, journalists tend to promote prestige forms regardless of income or status. So, depending on what you do, what kind of jobs you have will also have an impact on the way language is used. So, certain professions automatically encourage use of more formal or more prestige forms as opposed to the others, and income has nothing to do here. So, this concept measures how occupation requires competence in standard language. This is another type. The Marxist approach is based on the conflicting economic interests of the capitalists and the proletariats. This is well known. So, capitalist on the one hand and the worker on the other hand, there is a constant power struggle. So, there is the focus here is on power and conflict, and economic divisions shape social structures like ideology, religion, status and language and so on. So, the standard varieties of language reflect the dialect of the dominant classes, and so the middle class groups often work autonomously and value individualism, whereas industrial workers experience regimented routine for fostering solidarity, and as a result of which these two groups will be using language differently. This is broadly how class has been discussed and understood within these different kinds of approaches. Now, some studies, different kinds of studies in sociolinguistics which kept class as a variable. Of course, we have to go back to Lebov's work, stratification studies, where Lebov looked at his famous New York City study, 6 class groups. He looked at showing class differences, differentiated the use of the r sound. This is one of his most famous study, the r variable in New York City. his famous study of post vocalic ra, for example, in case of car pronounced with either pronounced with or without, and that was a class specific way of pronouncing the word. What it showed that was that higher social classes use the consonantal r more often. All speakers use it more in careful or formal speech styles. Now, this demonstrates that language reflects social class, but it is also shaped by context and style. So, the key insights that emerged from his studies were the social markers. The use of r, ra acts as a marker of social status. Knowledge of how to use it appropriately indicates membership in the speech community. So, if you know that this is a signal, then you will be able to use it appropriately. So, depending on which class you belong to or which class you want to appear to belong to, it will be decided by the use. Hypercorrection is another that he talked about, that lower middle class speakers sometimes overuse ra in formal speech to appear higher status, because once you are conscious of your that you probably do not use it normally, but the higher class uses it. So, you hypercorrect even when it need not be there. That these are some insights from his study. So, overt prestige and covert prestige are also ideas from this, has been discussed in another module. So, we will not discuss it in more detail here. So, high status forms approved by society, that is overt prestige. Covert prestige on the other hand is when we talk about language used by, even though it is not a high status language, but community still uses it as a kind of a signal of solidarity. So, these were most important takeaways from Lebow's studies. So, primarily it refers to orderly heterogeneity. Linguistic variation is quantitative and probabilistic and not random. It is, there is a method to that variation depending on the class, depending on also the intention, the context and so on. Other studies, similar studies, for example, we have discussed this elsewhere as well. So, Turgill's Norwich English, he examined class and neighborhood. Similarly, many others. So, Poplack worked on Ottawa Canadian French variation, then Sydney studies non-native speakers and immigrant population and so on and so forth. Many other studies have utilized the similar kind of parameters to look at class difference in studying. Network studies also, network density, how well connected the network is, what is the multiplexity, so multiple overlapping roles, friend, co-worker, neighbor and so on. Milroy's work is very important in this regard. So, the dense multiplex networks enforce norms, loose networks encourage linguistic innovation. Similarly, Eckert's high school study on high school children also looks at the groups. So, jocks versus burnouts. Linguistic differences reflect the expected adult social class. So, behavior that is reflected through language was actually taking them to different kinds of social classes. So, there are network studies. So, with different groups form their own network and so on. Similarly, agency, we have talked about agency as well. So, modern sociolinguistics examines individual choice and identity. So, speakers have a linguistic repertoire, set of variants they can use. Each of us may have access to different variants of the same language. Now, depending on what kind of identity we want to create, what kind of agency we want to reflect, we will be using a particular form in this particular format or that particular format. So, that is where agency, identity, these kind of ideas come into picture. We have discussed this before. So, both for example, Eckert and many others have looked at this particular way of looking at language with respect to class. Now, we have the last type here, which is a code. Language, sometimes class has a code. This is one of the most debated and for some time it remained controversial as well, where socially determined varieties have been studied, and this was for some time it was known as linguistic deficit theory. Now, that this development of this theory had its origin in the correlation between children's achievement in conventional education system and socio-economic factors. So, depending on the class you come from, it seemed to have a bearing on your success, on the child's success in the education system. So, Basil Bernstein sought to establish a relationship between social structure and forms of speech. So, he theorized that social groups carry contrasting values and these values are transmitted across generation in what he called it as the social genetic code. This idea he reflected through his understanding of what is called a quasi-linguistic concept of code. He called them two kinds of code, elaborate and restricted code. So, in his theory these codes are not just linguistic, but socially regulated systems of meaning that differentiate groups and reproduce inequalities. A social class based dichotomy between public language. Before he talked about restricted code and elaborate code, he talked about public language and formal language, that there are different kinds of language structure. One is considered public, the other is formal. That was already there before he talked about his codes. Now, how are they different? So, public language is the language of the unskilled strata, unskilled, semi-skilled and unskilled strata. So, what are the indicators? They will be having short, grammatically simple, often unfinished sentences, poor syntactic construction, low order of generality, reliance on implicit meaning, limited vocabulary, poor syntax, etc. So, this was based on initial idea of public language versus formal language was based on the syntactic difference. So, public language was more often than not it had poor syntax. So, shorter sentences, less complex and so on. Formal language on the other hand was the opposite. It had accurate grammatical order and syntax, grammatically complex sentence structure, explicit verbal mediation of individual qualification and language use, which points to the possibilities inherent in a complex conceptual hierarchy for the organizing of experience. This is how he puts it, how the formal language. So, formal language has the proper structure, public language has is not structured that well. That is how he started, and so it was later replaced with elaborate and restricted codes. These were semantic terms as having to do with implicitness, generality and context dependence later. So, the relative backwardness of many working class children who live in areas of high population density and in rural areas may well be a culturally induced backwardness transmitted by the linguistic process. Now, as a result of which these children had low performance on verbal IQ tests, their difficulty with abstract concepts, their failures within the language area, their general inability to profit from the school, all may result from limitations of a restricted code. That is how Bernstein expressed this in 1973. Now, this course initially of course, it was has this very limiting way of looking at it, that based on certain kinds of social scenario, based on the socio-economic status of the children, their language, because they are not their verbal IQ is low and there are many other limiting possibilities of their language. This was considered a very limiting sort of a system. But later it was understood to be, his codes were redefined or reanalyzed, and it was understood as differing orientation to the production of meaning rather than complete inability to create grammatical structures. Okay. So, differing principles of utterance organization then he calls about as elaborate and a restricted code. Depending on the code utilized, the speech is also called either a restricted speech or a elaborate speech. And then he traced these two different kinds of social system. One he called positional system or closed system, the other he called personal or open system. So, starting with the classes, then eventually class and the syntactic difference, grammatical difference. Eventually, he talks about the way meaning is constructed within sentences, and thereby he takes it to the semantic domain rather from the syntactic domain. And when he does that, he says that this language, the language use or the code has a direct correlation with the social structure within which you function. That social structure is not lower and upper class or low working versus middle class, but he called them positional or closed versus personal or open system. So, positional structure is where a close knit structure where members share a strong bond, their social roles are clear and well defined. Individual's social identity is derived from fixed categories like age, gender, etc. So, there is no ambiguity, as a result of which it is a very close knit small structure kind of a system. Even families, close friends, they can qualify to be a closed structure. So, there is a lot of shared understanding that the members of such a community, such a group will be having. So, you do not need to be very explicit when you speak, as a result of which sympathetic circularities will be used more. It is not because they cannot, but because they do not need to be explicit. That is how it is understood later. On the other hand, personal or open system, here the bonds among the members and the relative social position are less well defined. So, social roles and identity are achieved not by pre-decided criteria, but by the individual's disposition and temperament. So, language plays an important role here. Imagine yourself in a formal setup. There you have to speak clearly, your clarity of language and your clarity of thought should go together, and thereby you are trying to create the your image, the way the person next to you will create an image about you. So, you have to be very careful. So, this is an open system where your position is not predefined, you are creating it by the way you present yourself. Language plays an important role there, as a result of which here you will be more explicit with your syntax and your semantics and so on. So, this is the open system that he talks about. Open system will use the elaborate code. So, this is how the connection is, the same thing that I just talked about. Elaborate code was said to be used in the relatively formal educated scenario. That is how Crystal later discusses about it, and to permit speakers to individually be creative in their expression. It was said to be characterized linguistically by a relatively high proportion of such features as subordinate clause, adjectives, pronoun, and so on and so forth. So, when it is a formal language, when it is an elaborate code, it is actually the situation is typically educated scenario. So, that is how later on Crystal talks about, Crystal discusses it. But there was, as I said, there was a lot of criticism, and initially because of the way he put it directly correlated with the class and the lack of syntactic complexity, syntactic finesse and sophistication. So, as a result of which there was a lot of criticism he faced, and even some scholars even contradicted him with their own studies. So, Lebov is one of them who defended African American speech as equally complex, and later Bernstein as a result reframed codes in semantic terms, focusing on degree of context dependence versus independence. So, are we depending on the context and the shared knowledge, or are we not? That is how he later on redefined it. So, this shift allowed his theory to escape the deficit charge. That is how we started with linguistic deficit theory. So, by shifting from syntax to semantics and the way one positions oneself within the given scenario, given context, that is what decides which code he will use. Thereby, Bernstein was able to escape the charges. So, to deepen his theory, he introduced principles of classification, where talks about boundaries between categories of knowledge and then framing. These concepts helped explain how codes operate across different levels. So, from family to school to state, that is how. So, the idea of code has remained relevant because it was repositioned as a tool to understand language use across different kinds of domains. So, this shift from syntax to semantics as a result deepened the explanatory power of the theory and connected it to larger sociological and sociolinguistic traditions. Thus, the codes are more than just class, they reflect two contrasting set of semantic features. So, from the on the one hand you have implicit, context bound and particularistic versus you have explicit, context independent, universalistic and so on. That is how there was a shift. So, it is not just about class, it is about how you position yourself. And then later researchers have also pointed out that the method probably was wrong. The main problem probably is elsewhere. The type of questions that were asked to the children, the interviewer, they resemble known people in case of middle class children, but in case of working class children, the interviewer looks alien, he does not belong to their own category of people. So, that could also have impacted on their linguistic output. And the methods used. So, in place of questions which might elicit monosyllabic answers, storytelling or other methods might have been more useful. So, these are some of other later day criticisms of Bernstein codes. Nonetheless, the codes elaborate and restricted codes still have relevance today, because we can use it to understand how an individual, even in terms of social identity formation also. We have seen it in previous lectures that language can be, genres can be understood as performance. Language can be used to create or to reinforce identities. So, even codes can be utilized to understand that as well. So, to wrap up this module, we have in this module we looked at various nuances of language use within the social context, and while doing that we looked at different theories and their positions, their criticisms and so on. This relationship, and the take home lesson is that this relationship is layered and complex and depending on multitude of factors. It is not a straight jacketed kind of understanding that this class or this category will have this kind of language use. Society is dynamic, humans and their understanding of their position in the society is fluid and flexible. So, as a result of which the entire system, even though we understand them as different categories, even though we understand linguistic properties with respect to social properties, we still understand, we still also hopefully we have been able to underline that factor that this is a very nuanced kind of a domain and it is not a fixed domain. So, with this we wrap up this module. Thank you.